Welcome to the Escalate office hours. We are going to get started in just a minute. All right, so let's get started. I'm sure others will join shortly. Good afternoon, everyone. This is Sharon Pollock, and I am a TA coach from Apt Associates. I work with several sites, and I'm honored and privileged to introduce Deb Bourne, who will be leading today's office hours. Deb has a master's degree in social work and a medical degree. As both a social worker and a physician, she's worked with highly marginalized communities, including homeless persons, drug users, psychiatric patients, and incarcerated and recently released individuals. Deb is very interested in how research can inform and assist with community-based clinical work. HIV prevention is one of her personal and professional passions. And without further ado, I'm happy to turn the session over to Deb.
Thanks, Sharon. I was having technical issues. This is for question and answers. So the opportunity is for you to let me know what is important to you as we have this discussion. I do have a series of slides that we prepared, and I'm going to stop so that there's the opportunity to ask questions. So I can give you a little more background about what I have done and so where my perspective is coming from. I ran a very large FQHC for people experiencing homelessness and those recently housed in San Francisco for many years with a very large HIV patient and a large group of individuals who are at risk for getting HIV. We had the Tom Waddell was the first trans clinic in the country and still is a leader in this work. After that, I have been doing public health and policy and finding innovative ways to bring HIV prevention and care to individuals that had not typically received those care in our mainstream clinics. That includes people who use drugs. So I'm very excited to talk to you about this. I am an addiction doctor as well, and this is the area that I do think about and is a lot of my direct clinical work. So we're going to go through the neurobiology of our brains and trauma and stigma, because substance use and addiction really is about neurobiology in our own cells. How do we ask about substance use, harm reduction policies and approaches, overdose policies, and some quick tips? I've geared the conversation to both health centers and public health departments, since we have a broad range, and because that's what I do. I do direct work and I do population health work and public health work. So we'll be going back and forth. If you could, in the chat, just put in, oh, everyone's here. If we can put in where you're from, you can go on screen too, but you can put in who you're from, where you're from, if you're from Alliance, the Diverse Resilient, EOCIL, and a little bit about what your role is. Thank you. If you want to speak up, you can. So hi, shout out to Philadelphia. Afara.
Hello.
Hi. Albert, hi. From in Nevada, not too far away from me in San Francisco. You're an health educator with Ryan, right?
Yes, I am. Lots of fun.
And Justin, we have a small group, so I'm just calling everyone out. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Hello, beautiful humans. I'm Justin Roby, Director of HIV Care at Diverse and Resilient.
Great. And my pronouns are she and her, and thank you, Justin, for putting your pronouns in. I'm curious if anyone has any burning questions. When I sent out the survey, these were some of the questions that we had asked, and about half of you said that they didn't have any services in their jurisdictions, either direct that really dealt with substance use, either in their programs, or didn't feel like they had the specialty. And many people discussed how substance use just really impact health engagement. Is there any other questions that people have so I just can know how to gear the conversation? Okay, well, I'm going to stop during our call and ask a shout out so that we can use your really precious time really wisely. And first, I want to thank you all for taking the time in your day for looking at this conversation, because really issues that face people that are using drugs really are important opportunities for us to learn about stigma and the impact of stigma in general in our health centers. And I always like to ground into the concept of sanctuary trauma and why this matters when we're talking about health and care. And I don't know if any of you, we have some new folks in here. If we could just put in the chat, Sharon, asking people to introduce themselves in the chat, a reminder, and where you're from, and if you have any burning questions. So sanctuary trauma is when someone has come for either healthcare or social service care, and they're thinking they're going to be getting protection and support, and they actually become re-traumatized. Either the going to the emergency room traumatizes them, or something about the situation reminds them of an experience that they've had. It is extremely important to understand. It occurs, it's probably with the humans that I serve, it's probably the number one issue and barrier to care, is understanding people's experience of sanctuary trauma. It not only hurts the people we're serving and trying to help, but it also impacts us as care providers and as health departments. Now, the thing that's important with stigma, and I'm going to go into this a little bit with biology, is that it can be felt either from judgment, you shouldn't be using drugs, I judge you for using drugs. Fear, I'm scared because this person looks really high, I don't know what to do. Or paternalism, I think you should stop using drugs and I know it's fast and let me help you in every way I can to help you because I care about you so much. All of those, which are normal human reactions, are felt as stigma on someone else's body. So I'm going to start first with the neurobiology of trauma and addiction, because all of our policies, if done well, really should be grounded in understanding what goes on with trauma, with addiction, and how it impacts stigma. So most of you have heard of fight, flight, and freeze. Fawn is a new understanding that it is actually a reaction that we have to a trigger to placate the threat. Now, this isn't necessarily placating the threat of a snake. Say you're seeing a snake and you want to either fight the snake, run away, or you're frozen. But often many people have a response to something that's scary to them, say a little kid whose parent is yelling. They really will do everything they can to placate that threat, and it is a trigger response. What's important to understand about all of these four responses is they are natural responses in humans. And if we didn't have them, none of us would be here, and neither would our ancestors. They've kept us alive. What causes a trauma response in someone's body is actually what happens after the threat. It's when we're not safe after the threat to process the experience. So for many individuals, it's not just oh, this is really scary with the snake. If we don't have a possibility to kind of get away and process it, it turns into trauma in our body. And so part of the response in the fear process becomes automatic as well. And really, as clinicians, and I do a lot of work with trauma, it's unpacking that. But it's really important to understand this when we're creating policies in health centers and when we're creating policies to support agencies. So a little more about the biology. In our brain, the area called the amygdala is where the center for addiction sits. We have the place in blue where we have receptors to get the response to neurotransmitters. We have the place that does with withdrawal, and then we have the whole front of our brain, the prefrontal cortex, that's involved with anticipatory wanting to use again. And interestingly, one of the number one reasons why people pick up again, and I can put in the chat, if anyone guesses, I'll actually send you a prize. But the number one reason people use again is boredom. And that's because our frontal lobe is so important in how we're actually engaged as humans. And when that frontal lobe isn't engaged, it can actually lead to boredom. So understanding this, and guess what? It's the center of the fight, flight, freeze, and feign response. So everything we do impacts this area. So when we look at creating impactful health centers and programs for people who use drugs, we really need to understand how we help people's nervous system engage. And you see down on the green, we want people to be in a place where they can feel compassion, that they have curiosity, they're mindful, and we also want the people running the programs, doing the work, to be in that place as well. And if we're all in the freeze, fight, or response high up there in our nervous system because we don't know what to do to help this person who's using drugs, we're really unsure. All of this is important for all of us to get down to this social engagement, kind of, they call it the vagal response, the after Thanksgiving dinner where we're all chilled out response. That's where we want to be, and that's why we want to create policies that help get us there. My last little thing, and I can never get away with not talking about what all of us have in our brains to feel good. And all of you have these things. There's dopamine. We get that when we have something that feels good. So I eat a really good sandwich. I'm about to drink my really favorite tea. I get dopamine when I teach with you. I get dopamine because I love it. It's what gets us excited and jazzed in our brain. Serotonin, many of you heard when we go to sleep. Oxytocin, when you hug each other, when you're breastfeeding, and when you have an orgasm, and endorphins when you run. Now, all of these feel-good chemicals are seen in drugs. Dopamines and methamphetamine, cocaine, and most things actually, even opiates, actually get translated into dopamine quite often in our bodies. And guess what else releases dopamine? When you have that to-do list and you check, click, click, that actually releases dopamine in your brain. So we, as providers and as health leaders, also have these chemicals that the people that we're serving and the people that we work with have some imbalances in those receptors. So I'm just going to show this to you briefly. Don't get overwhelmed. This is a slice of the brain. And if you look at cocaine, meth, alcohol, and heroin, in the control, that means brains that have not used drugs, you see a lot of red, and that means there is dopamine receptors. That part of the brain that I showed you is ready to go and they can receive dopamine. And guess what? Look at the addicted people who use drugs a lot. They have less receptors. They're not ready. They have not as many activity. They need to do more to get the dopamine. So understanding, and the reason why this matters is that dopamine and all of this trauma relationship is really important when we're trying to help individuals either listen, sit still in our offices, set a goal for their health, talk to us about really what's going on, concentrate. They're already coming in with some level of deficit from their addiction. And if you're traumatized, I don't know about you, but I went to the doctor the other day. I was feeling scared. I couldn't hear one thing that they said to me. I actually had to write it down and look at my AVS because I got some challenging news about a procedure I had to go through. I couldn't listen. I was in this trauma state. So really understanding it's a natural human response to have this fight, flight, or freeze, but it does impact by how you respond as a clinician or a leader, and also the people that we're serving. So let's get into substance use moving forward. If there's any questions about this, please put it in the chat. And Sharon, if I can't see them, I'm inviting you to just chime up if you see any questions as I'm presenting. Thank you. So how do we talk about substance use, and should we? Now, in the response that many of you had, you said, we don't ask about it unless it comes up. And one thing want to get across to all of you, whether you're a health department or you're an agency, we have to start having these conversations. Until we talk about what it means to use drugs and how it's impacting us, both as clinicians and the humans we're serving, we're not going to be able to address the issues. And that doesn't mean that we're trying to get everyone to stop using, but we need to have conversations. So at least at intake, many of you said intake, but at least yearly to start to talk about it. In some situations, even in health centers where you don't think there's a lot of people using drugs, people are getting asked every visit. Now, I work with a population that about 80% of the people are using drugs or have used drugs. So we have a different, it's a different community. I know who they are. I know my population. And you need to talk about who's going to ask the question. Some people said only a social worker does. But if all of us can't ask the question, we might not get to the answer. And in some centers, like the folks I work with, it's actually safer for the peers to do it. And I work with a lot of peer navigators, and it's really increased our ability to have real conversations that matter. Everyone needs to be trained on what to do if there's a response to a yes, and really having opportunities for staff to discuss their successes and challenges. So those are just some parameters around the question. Now, I don't know if any of you have heard of SBIRT. For some people in our last talk, it was new, but it's screening, brief intervention, and referral to treatment. This is from the SAMHSA website, and I have resources in here if you're interested about what SBIRT is. And it is a really brilliant concept of screening, a brief intervention, and referral to treatment. And it's done in mainstream primary care centers. And this link, where I got this from, is actually about Medicare because it's reimbursable. All of your screening and what you're doing, there's a link for CMS about how it's actually reimbursed for health centers to use. But basically about how to ask about the question, how to do a brief intervention and respond to a yes, maybe to do some motivation, and then referring to treatment. And I encourage you all to look into this as an option. There's some great trainings out there. And some basic ways to ask, and I separated alcohol from drugs because alcohol is, quote, legal. And as a physician, I can say I've seen more harm physically in people's bodies from alcohol than I have from drugs, except for, of course, the fentanyl crisis. But general questions about how often do you drink in a week, how many drinks do you drink, all the way down to how has it impacted your health? How does alcohol support you? And that question, that third question, how does it support you, is part of the awareness that we're normalizing, that people have picked up using alcohol for a reason. I don't know if any of you had a drink after work after a hard day. You're using it at a social party. We all, it's a legal thing, and we've used it for many reasons to celebrate. There's a reason why cultures have had alcohol throughout the ages. So asking that question is about how does it support you? I love having a glass of wine at a Passover Seder. So how does it help you? How does it actually help you with your community connections? How does it help you as an individual? We can have these conversations whether someone is using it as an addiction or not. And down to drug use, I actually showed these questions to one of my colleagues, Mary Howe, who runs our Homeless Youth Alliance, and I'm very educated. She's my go-to trainer to teach me everything I need to know. And she said, why would you actually ask about substance use? She said, I ask, what's your drug of choice? It's really important to her to know. She went syringe exchanges. So there's a whole range of how to actually ask people about substance use. And again, how does it support you? How is it impacting your health? And do you want to cut back, keep using, or stop? Also understanding how harm reduction, which we're going to talk about later, really impacts what we're doing with prevention. And when you screen, you're looking at prevention for harm, and it's really part of an overall continuum about screening and being ready for harm reduction, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. Okay. I put this in this general screening to talk about the other question that people had about how do we work with people who use drugs, because I can't actually get them started on medication for TB if someone's using drugs, or in my case, I also work with people experiencing homelessness. If someone's shooting up every day, they can't start their PrEP. And I'm here to tell you that's 100% not true. And in both my research and in my direct work, it doesn't necessarily impact someone's ability, but how we work with folks who have had stigma to come to our health centers really is the magic. So one of the most successful things is direct observed therapy and incentives. both contingency management, which is where you give someone incentive for having a clean urine, a urine that doesn't have drugs in it, is really important in one of the few proven therapies for methamphetamine use. And using that as a central component to really look at how you're doing incentives. And it doesn't have to be money or gift certificates. We once did it for tiaras in one of our programs, and people wanted to get a tiara to be virally suppressed. So connecting the medicine to what they're doing every day, whether you're brushing your teeth and if someone's getting well first thing in the morning, I've put their HIV pill packs and their PrEP pill packs in their kit, in their works when they're getting well in the morning. Having a buddy system for use, that's really important because we don't want people who use opiates and fentanyl to use alone. So I have a couple who's unhoused. They get well several times during the day. They have their HIV needs together and they make sure they use together, and it's their buddy system. They're both undetectable and have never been in to see a clinician. I actually see them in my next statement at a syringe exchange. So going to where people feel safe as the first step of engagement and where you want to keep their meds. We've had some wonderful programs with Hep C treatment and PrEP in our syringe exchange where we have med lockers. At the syringe exchange where I work, many people are undetectable. We've actually never been to see a provider, and we just keep everything where people feel safe and do the work there. Having monthly injections, we just started doing HIV injections at our syringe exchanges and many of our centers, really important. We've seen this work really well with people who need antipsychotics, and it's very exciting with HIV that is now an option. Having peers that either bring the meds to the people or bring them into clinic, peers or case managers, but we've really found that peers are very powerful. And it's a great way to support folks that have gone through the process themselves. And the thing I love the most, which is integrated mobile teams. I put a link to some of the work that we've done in San Francisco on a SPINS project about mobile care and about the importance of mobile care for HIV. And now we do mobile care with PrEP, and we're doing mobile care for post-overdose in San Francisco with a really exciting program as well. All right, and no questions on that. I'm going to move to harm reduction, taking a breath. I am from the East Coast, even though I live in the West Coast. That was a lot, but these slides are available for you and that you can review them yourself. But harm reduction really is important, understanding that is a critical part of treatment, and it is not sanctioning drug use. It's sanctioning good care and good medicine, as me as a doctor thinks. And the principles of harm reduction, this is from Harm Reduction Coalition. It's really the go-to place for everything to learn about harm reduction. And condoms are harm reduction. Wearing a seatbelt is harm reduction. We do and practice harm reduction in everything we do, but understanding the importance of it with people that are using drugs is really critical. And it's important to think about both as clinical direct service work and with our policies. I like to say that harm reduction to doctors is really giving the right medicine at the right dose, at the right time, in the right formulation. And whether you're a physician like me and I prescribe medication, so I prescribe the PrEP, I prescribe the HIV med, you as health leaders are holding spaces to understand that you don't want anyone to get the wrong medicine. So harm reduction is critical. So what is it? Harm reduction? It's a set of principles and strategies aimed to reduce the negative consequences associated with drug use, not just both to the individual, but also in creating those safe spaces and the stigma. It includes a spectrum of strategies for safer use and to respect people to come where they're at. That's how we create safe spaces, that you're accepting the individual to come as they are, and that we offer all treatment in increments, and that you allow humans to set their own goals. Part of harm reduction is understanding our language. And one of my other go-to is harmreductiontherapy.org. They're amazing trainers, great books. Please check the site. They have a lot of freebies on there too. And really thinking about our language that looks at disease and moving to more of a biopsychosocial model of understanding our health. And I want to go into something I actually just said myself, which is clean. So even when I talk about urine, all urine is actually by nature clean because it unless it has an infection. So, but we're using the term abstinent, not using negative consequences to harm. they need to bottom out. The bottom's dangerous. Let's prevent it. Recovery, change. So these are some important work. Addiction to, say, creative drug use. This really starting to look at our policies that we have written and where we're using some of these words is a great place to start. And helping each other kindly like we do in other areas when we're all learning new language. So I might use the wrong word. I already have. And so just really helping each other with kindness to get to that place. The principles of harm reduction, comes from recoveryanswers.org, really another great site, is to have non-judgmental approaches, treating all individuals with dignity, and really committed to universal human rights, which is why you've all signed up for the stigma grant in the first place. That you believe and know that everyone deserves to have an opportunity to flourish, and that we need to also do this for people that use drugs. And often they're the last people, and the parity of services, it's been astounding to me, especially in the HIV treatment and prevention world, understanding the importance of empowering and doing agency, just like we do with all other groups, the same for people who use drugs. So these are actually harm reduction policies that I took from the Department of Public Health policy on harm reduction. So whether you're a health department or an organization and a health center, these are great policies. In San Francisco, our Board of Supervisors has declared that every department needs to have an overdose and harm reduction policy. So this is actually at the highest level. We need to look at harm reduction and how we set the stage for the work that we do. So I'm not going to go in the detail. I'm looking at the time, and there's a lot of words here, but really understanding there's 7 policies here. The first page, there's 3. That clients are responsive to culturally competent, non-judgmental services delivered in a manner that demonstrates respect for the individual's dignity, personal strength, and self-determination. Sounds a lot like the trainings that you've been going through and what you know for stigma. So the principles of harm reduction are the basics of a lot of the work we do in stigma. Service providers are responsible to a wider community for delivering interventions which attempt to reduce the economic, social, and physical consequences of drug use. And then lastly, because those engaged in unsafe health practices are often difficult to reach through traditional services and venues, that we're actually coming out with ways and innovative ways to help get them to tap into someone's human potential. That there's treatment that needs to include these strategies. So when you look at its treatment level, that you understand harm reduction is this treatment. That relapse or picking up again is not a failure. It's part of what we understand the nature of the work. As I showed you in the brain, it's the frontal lobe. And boredom, we wouldn't have judgment of someone saying they're bored. That's not a moral issue. But understanding that this is picking up is part of the process, because it's interesting. I know many of you are going to talk about overdose. The people that are overdosing in my life are my colleagues that picked up again, and when they have failure, they don't let people know that they have. So understanding this concept is really important with our overdose prevention, especially in with stigma, so that people don't hold on to the shame of picking up. Each program has a systematic, comprehensive services, and that people change in increments, and that you're just celebrating people for taking any step they can. And I'm going to talk about what that looks like on a clinical level. So here's some sample examples of harm reduction policies. Some of these are taken from our Board of Supervisors. They're really high level. They're not necessarily what you see in health centers, but you can extrapolate that. To make sure information materials are accessible about substance use treatment, because harm reduction doesn't mean we don't want to help people stop using, but you want to be ready for when they're ready to cut back or stop using or change a behavior. All providers and contractors know about how to make referrals and have that be part of your process. Post up-to-date information about locations and schedules of syringe exchanges. This is actually really important. Even with our Department of Public Works, making sure that they're posting that information up. Overdose responses, because that is happening in many different locations, and even sometimes in the bathrooms of our programs, in our drop-in centers. Making sure that all staff, all agencies are actually trained in harm reduction, overdose, mindfulness, and motivational interviewing. And then lastly, really taking a stand and having policies that we are going to put the consumer and the person with the lived experience center in the conversation, that they are key members of our steering committees, advisory panels, they're part of our quality improvement committees, and they review the policies that we put out. I do want to talk a little bit in the idea again to the brain, and I'm always going to have a couple slides about the brain with harm reduction to understand that vicarious trauma, which is the experience that what you're going through. So if Justin, who I just met, hi, if you told me a story about your boss getting mad at you and yelling at you, and I hope that never happens, or experience you had at work, and you PET scanned your brain and my brain, we're going to have the same response to your traumatic event. It's how we're wired as individuals. So in the harm reduction process, understanding that if you're going to have policies to support people talking about their drug use, which can be really challenging for many of us to hear, understanding your staff's brains, supervisors' brains, your leaders' brains are going to be having a lot of the same processes. Understand how our past and present experience impact how we care for people. I've lost a sibling to substance use. That impacts me. How I'm in recovery, that impacts me. How our patients and colleagues are impacted in their nervous system is important. And that how we are looking at our dopamine hit from trying to get someone, how many people did you get into treatment, and changing that, because I'm going to check the box, I had 20, to how many people did you have a conversation with about their substance use? So how are we actually helping our staff get a dopamine hit or getting a check the box from things that are different in the conversation than just treatment? And again, I'm not going to go into detail of this, but thinking about our staff's brain and wellness is important because they have to understand their triggers. We want our staff to be in that green zone so they can have conversations in that green zone. So this means that we can not be so manipulative about forcing someone to be in our treatment plan. So that those kinds of policies for staff, and this is an issue with stigma. And whenever I come and talk in the TA programs that I work with in Waikiki, we've already talked about how do you do staff counseling, wellness, and mindfulness? Because we want to have really challenging conversations and we want everyone's nervous system to be in a place where they can do that. Making sure people have clear job descriptions and team building, part of quality improvement. Honor people's lived experience and how to bring that into the conversation. And really a huge commitment to training, coaching, and mentoring, not just one training, but that you have the opportunity for ongoing conversations about harm reduction, motivational interviewing, and some of the successes and challenges about referral to treatment and therapy. So I'm going to take a breath there before I get to if there's any questions right now. Thanks. Any questions on harm reduction? We have time for some conversations. I'm going to talk a little bit about overdose.
I've asked participants to share if they have any policies specifically addressing treatment for individuals who use drugs. And Justin just responded that he doesn't, though, however, they're at an agency that's in love with policies more about action, though they're entering into a new era. A policy could be useful.
I would encourage all of you to look at ESPERT, because if you're taking baby steps into this world of talking about substance use, it really is a very important best practice that's really seen very easily in the mainstream. They do it at my doctor's office. Just like how 10 years ago, starting to talk about domestic violence or depression was something that we didn't see a lot. Now we're seeing more and more, and we're going to be seeing more and more about stigma and safety. But are you safe at home? And how do you feel? Those questions, we're seeing those more and more, right? So ESPERT is actually reimbursable, and it might be a great place to start for anyone dipping their toes. Thanks, Sharon. I'm going to talk about overdose because we cannot talk about substance use without addressing the overdose crisis. And because fentanyl is actually in finding its way into pills illegally, it's also finding its way into stimulants. We're seeing people having fentanyl and fentanyl overdoses, even not knowing that they're using drugs. So we're seeing it with youth. We're seeing it with amphetamine, people that use amphetamines and cocaine, even recreationally on the weekends. So I wanted to open up to see if anyone, and please put on the chat, what types of programs do you have for overdose? So in our last call, people were talking about this very cool thing about putting in Narcan dispensers and some syringe dispensers so that people could just pick it up without even asking questions. And a lot of our drop-in sites, we just have Narcan in little containers on the wall. People just pick them up and leave and don't even need to sign them out. In health centers, a lot of programs are automatically requiring Narcan prescriptions for any time you do any opiate. And that's actually in my Epic. As a doctor, I prescribed a medication for someone after surgery, and there the Narcan just popped right up. So making Narcan prescriptions just part of your work. Philadelphia just opened a Narcan vending machine. Oh, I'm super excited to hear about that. Having education test strips and test strips available. They're very hard to use, but they're actually they're great for providers. They like to, so that we can give something and actually have conversations. But a lot of the people I work with say they can be hard to use. Education materials and signs and discussions, staff training. I'm curious if any of you have had an overdose training in. You have, so Justin just said that he had Narcan and naloxone for staff dispensing to the general public. Yeah, that's great. Many states actually have programs where they get Narcan in California. CBOs can sign up and receive Narcan to get them dispensed. And Justin, I can look into how to get those in your state for the fentanyl. Peer outreach, again, peers always really, everything I know has been from humans that have had lived experience to teach to us how to talk about this. Post-overdose counseling and support. We have a program in San Francisco that, and a lot of other jurisdictions where we go out and reach out to people that have had an overdose. One of the number one indicators of the risk of overdose is having had a recent overdose. So really important to actually ask this question. I actually have it. I ask people, how many times did you miss your pills in the last 3 days and then last month? And how many times did you overdose in the last month or someone you know? I actually put it in as one of my routine screening questions.
Deb, there's a question in the chat from Albert, and he asks, how do you think your vicarious experience with substance use impacts your practice in comparison with someone without direct experience or secondary experience?
Okay, I'm just gonna get this off the screen and then we can start the conversations with that, Sharon, if that's okay. It's like it's such an important question. Albert, if you're okay, I'm gonna go through this one part because I want to spend a lot of time unpacking that question. Does that sound okay, Sharon?
Absolutely.
And so I'm going to give you my 4 quick tips for working with people who use drugs. Whether you're a drug clinician or not, these tips are very helpful. The first is gratitude. Now, something about gratitude for you, and when I teach doctors this too, I actually let them know that the gratitude first and foremost is for you, the person giving the gratitude. When they've looked at people with gratitude practices, being in the space of gratitude or gratitude meditation, it lowers blood pressure, increases immune system, increases flow into the blood, your memory's better, etc. And so a lot of the work I do is teach other clinicians how to communicate. And I let them know that if you can't thank the person that's in the room with you, then you need to step out because you're not in optimal shape. It's like driving a car with a flat tire. Your brain's not working, your being's not working, your nervous system's not ready. So this really is the most important practice. And I do this with my kids. My teenager comes home and I just thank her for not slamming the door that day. Thanks for coming in. But thank you for taking care of your health and coming to the health center. Thank you so much for picking up these syringe. Thank you for trying and using our Narcan dispenser. What do you think of it? Thanks for talking to me about your drug use. Thank you for signing up for health insurance, and thank you for waiting. And thank you for being here, all of you. All right, asking permission. This increases safety. I just showed that to Albert, who didn't say no, but saying, okay, Albert, I want you to feel your question was really important to me. And is it okay if I just get to it afterwards? Is it okay if I ask you this? That really helps our nervous system. It gets us to that green place, that calm place, that after Thanksgiving turkey place where your vagus nerve, your nervous system can be calm. What do you want make sure we talk about before where our time is over. You signed up, you're here at the health center. How can I make sure that you get your questions answered? And one of the really important things, I'm going to jump to the bottom, which is asking people if they need us to stop. Remember that picture I showed you about people really feeling overwhelmed and not necessarily able to learn when they're feeling triggered. And I got this from one of my place where I learned to do a pelvic exam all those years ago as a student. Someone said you can teach someone to say stop. And we want people to be comfortable. Pelvic exams are just, a really overwhelming experience for all individuals on both sides of the table. And you give people permission to say stop if it feels uncomfortable. But when I'm encouraging all of you, when you're doing an intake, when you're having a conversation, to say, listen, sometimes all these questions can be overwhelming, or sometimes I might go too fast. If you want me to stop, I can, because you're in control. You're in the driver's seat. Let's practice stop. And I do that. Now, often when I do talks, I say, if I go too fast, tell me to stop or slow down. That's okay too. All right. The next is curiosity. When we're curious, actually, our brains can't sit in judgment. Isn't that interesting? Oh, this person when I'm driving is really, they're going fast. They cut me off instead of being like, hey, you, blah, blah, blah. That is so curious that really made me upset. And so we can use judgment as a signpost. Ooh, I'm judging. I'm curious. And so instead of being like, you don't want to get that blood work, person and blah, 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 we get all judgmental with person, set everything up and then I don't want to get blood work. I'm curious. Are you willing to share why you don't want that blood work? Listen, we just got your case manager, your cousin, and you all got together to talk about starting your meds today. I'm just curious why today it doesn't feel like the day for you. Instead of like, oh, I did all this work. Turning it into curiosity. I'm really not sure how to support you right now. I don't know what to do. What's worked before? And that question alone helps my nervous system, helps yours. Well, you don't know how to treat people that use drugs. I'm overwhelmed by people coming in. You walked in the door. There's a part of you that loves yourself enough to do that. I worked in a methadone program. I have so much respect for every human that walked in the door. There's a part of you that loves yourself more than the shame of declaring that you use opiates. Wow. How can I support you? And lastly, connection. We all need to have someone with us. If we all do. And whether it's ourselves because you feel comfortable and safe enough, because we count too, or another person. When I was telling you about my own personal experience going to the doctor, I called my friend right before. Listen, I'm finally, all right, true disclosure, I'm 57, had my first mammogram. I was scared. I called my girlfriend right before I went. I'm finally doing it. So how do we hold space? The humans that I work with have so much trauma that I regularly see a patient or a client alone in a room. It's an opt-out for me. Your case manager is going to come at the beginning so that we can set an agenda. They'll leave and then they'll come back again because I know that their nervous system is going to be safer. You can even call the case manager. Some recommendations before we start with Albert's great question. These are great books. My Grandmother's Hand, really about mindfulness practices. It talks a lot about white body supremacy and equity, but has a lot of great exercises that for anyone working with people that have had stigma, really a great place to start. Motivational interviewing for healthcare, quick, down and dirty. Even if your health center is not able to do training on motivational interviewing, you can have a book club and a lunchtime. And one of my favorite books with my friend Matt Bennett, I teach and train with him about connecting motivational interviewing to the neurobiological nature of illness of the brain and addiction that I just went over with you today, and some other great resources. So let's get started. I'm going to take a breath. Let's get started on that question, Sharon, because it was really great. And we can stop sharing and people can come on screen. We have about 15 minutes. I'm having a hard time finding that question. And there was a couple parts. Oh, here it is, Albert.
You
So
got
if we could stop sharing. And people want to come on, that's great. If they don't, your names are beautiful too. Thank you. Do you want to, hi Justin, nice to see you in IRL, kind of IRL. So how do you think your vicarious experience with someone with substance use impacts your practice in comparison with someone without direct experience or secondary experience with using drugs? Um, and Albert, if you want to elaborate a little more on that question before we dive in.
Hello? Hi.
Okay.
So to elaborate further, I'm fairly new at the health district. I'm new to my position. I'm new to Escalate, new to everything really in terms of these realms. And I know that a lot of times within working with Ryan White and working with our guests, a lot of times there is an overlap of substance use. And I guess trying to figure out like the most informed way that we could help them out in case a lot of us don't have that kind of direct experience already, or even if our secondary experience is very limited within like the clinical work setting, because you don't know what you don't know of like in terms of best practice and making sure that we are uh, moving with the best step forward. Because learning on the job's great, but sometimes it's not the most effective way or the most efficient way, because you could always develop a terrible habit or what have you
Mhm.
and may not never know it. You know what I mean?
So I'm going to answer the question and talk a little bit about vicarious trauma because you did start with that. Um, but I would start with that slide I showed about the language, just like we do with everything else. Uh, I for example, my eldest child is non-binary, and they were born a particular gender. I was their mother, and I have to stop myself and get grounded so that when I talk about a story from their past, I actually can use the gender even in the past that they identify with. And that takes me where I need to slow down, I need to take a breath, and I need to hold their experience in the center. That same principle that all of us, you all are here because we're determined to give the best HIV care, right? That determination, that love, that courage, right? I always actually say that I want to have the same courage of the humans that I serve. That's what I'm here. I'm here ready to show up for. So, really figuring out your level of motivation for what you're willing to look at in your own vulnerabilities, right? So, that's the first place to stop. And I think language is really like we do with pronouns, with a lot of our SOGI work, really starting with language. Very easy to do. And it does require our brain to change. And the Grandmother's Hands talks a lot about that book. I can't recommend it enough, Albert, because all of this is in our nervous system. It's in your nervous system. We grew up in a society, and it's in your forebearers' nervous system. And so, how do we actually get, instead of judging that you were going to make a mistake, I celebrate, Albert, you being perfectly imperfect. I want you to come as you are. You're in the exact right place to be in this job. And so starting there, which is actually the fundamental thing for all the work we're trying to do with stigma, right? We're trying to say it, doing that for yourself. And my teacher always said responsibility is our response to ourselves. So in any of this work, just start there because you're really good enough. And in the
Well,
places you
thank you. I
don't.
appreciate that.
Yeah. Right, because we have to have the fundamental understanding that every human has within them the ability to know what they need for themselves, right? And so we need to start with ourselves. So I know that about you. I know that about Kayla and Afra and Justin and Denny and Kelly and everyone, right? I know that you have the information. You might not be in the right job or something might be hard or but you have it. So that's the principle we have when we show up to address stigma, right? That's one of the fundamental principles that everyone has the right. So that's the first thing, whether it's substance use or not. Now, vicarious trauma comes into that because if your brain had an experience where you failed your 2 classes in your major in college, right? You're coming and having like I have an I don't know feeling when someone has an experience. Your brain is really susceptible to I don't knows, right? That could be your story. So understanding that we have our past story, and on top of it, we all have vicarious trauma. So vicarious trauma means that you're going to have the physiological experience. And if you've had other trauma, it hits you harder because you have this work in that area of your brain to take care of it. So let's go back to you wanting to be the best you can be in public health, right? You failed your class, you didn't fail your classes, but let's just say that you had an experience. So does that make sense? So it's all really about the brain. Isn't that fascinating? All of this is about the brain. It's also a spiritual issue, but it's about the brain. So understanding that it's not going to bother you as much. Let's just say as I'm going to use Justin because you're on the camera, if you don't mind. Is that okay if I use you as my example? Thank you. See, I'm asking permission. So say Justin actually, he failed this class, but he didn't care. He thought that was hysterical. It's like, I failed my major and it just made him work harder. It helped him work harder, right? For whatever, it was not part of his story. When he's feeling uncertain, when he's like, a person's using drugs, you're having vicarious trauma, it's not going to hit that story. Does that make sense? So it has a saying about people's relationship because we're all different. We have different thumbprints. We have different brains. So the issue with substance use that's really important is that you do not have to have used a substance or had an addiction to empathize with the experience. And that's why I show that dopamine, oxytocin, serotonin, endorphins, because guess what? All of you have it too. And there's not one of you that doesn't feel good checking off the box. And some of us check off a box more. Now, I'm someone who is in recovery myself. I don't often come out with that. But I am. And you know the thing I'm most addicted to? Helping people. Worst addiction I've ever had. Next was actually in relationship. Worst addiction. Being in a health, right? So all of us have had the experience where our brain got something that it needed because there was something that it needed. And I'm glad I was addicted to work because I helped a lot of people. It saved my life, but it's not serving me anymore, right? So that's the part where there's the disease. That's when it becomes harmful. There's nothing wrong with working hard. All of you are here because you work hard, you're committed. But when it becomes unhealthy and we're using it as our only dopamine hit, there's not one person on this planet that can't empathize in some capacity. And it's part of how we can figure out compassion. Now, with motivational interviewing, with stigma, with everything, I tell people, you do not need to care. You absolutely do not need to care about the person that you're talking to. You don't. I'm glad that I care. I'm so thankful to the universe that that's part of who I am. But you don't have to have compassion to do the work. You just need to want to do your job well. Now, compassion helps and it's important in creating safety. And it feels good for us, right? And when I said I cared about you all, but you could feel the compassion. It energetically creates space. Now, I can also get a little esoteric and say that in that polyvagal theory work for the slide that I showed you with the green down the bottom and the pictures, it's actually a theory that my nervous system impacts your nervous system. That when I sit across from you and I'm like hyped up, you get hyped up, whether I say anything or not. So it is real. It's kind of the same mechanism that birds know where to go when they're flying, right? Like how we communicate, pheromones are real and our nervous systems are real. So creating safety for our staff and starting with ourselves is really fundamental for creating spaces for people who use drugs because it is probably the number one area we have the most judgment on people. And many of the people we serve have QA factors. I take care of BIPOC, HIV positive, trans women who are experiencing homelessness, and are addicted to like 6 substances. You don't get any better than that. And when people look at the thing that has hurt them the most, it's so interesting. It's their drug use. We hold on to that. And that's that's driving me. This is a long answer, and I want to have some space for other questions. Was that helpful? I hope that was helpful for everyone. Justin's nodding and smiling too. But it is why I start this conversation. Sharon's like, why so many things about the brain? Because we have to go back to biology. And it also normalizes it for us too, right? Did that help, Albert?
Yes, thank you so much. I really appreciate you taking the time. I think it's very insightful and, like it can be very intimidating for a lot of folks, including myself, if you don't have that kind of experience and kind of, what's the word, background that may propel you forward in other ways that you may not think so and what have you. So I really do appreciate it. Thank you so much.
And I'm curious. You just get curious. Those 4 things that I gave you, the thank you, the permission, having someone else with you, get curious. I'm really curious. And we need the 360 view for all of us. We just don't want to have old timers like me who've been doing this for 30 years. I'm not always right. We need to be curious, and to get curiosity, we need containers with diversity, right?
Can I jump in, Deb?
Yeah.
So, you mentioned a number of themes, Deb, and to answer your question, Albert, part of it is just you come into any role, any new role where you don't have skills, you have to be willing to have an open mind. You have to be you have to be kind to yourself when you make mistakes, because you're gonna make mistakes. And I think that with the curious part is find people at your agency that have the experience and find a mentor. I just think about like parenting. Like when you become a parent, you have no skills. I mean, maybe you babysat a little bit when you were younger, but it's a journey, it's a ride, and there are a lot of ups and downs. And I think that with any new role that you take on, you have to be willing to learn. You have to be okay to make mistakes, because you're going to. And I think, with the curiosity is take that curiosity and explore and take risks, and also find people that you trust and that you respect their approach, and learn from them.
We can't be ourselves by ourselves. That's why in the connection. So thank you, Sharon, the fourth principle that I brought in. And so if we're feeling this way and in our own uncomfortableness, imagine someone who has all of those stigmatizing things that, as I said, to even walk into a methadone program, I just respect people so much, right? So it just, our human experience really makes a difference. Any other questions? Because there's a statement where someone was asking about test strips.
I don't see any other questions in the chat. Do you want to just pose one last question? Deb, we have just a few additional minutes for people to respond.
Well, I'm curious. So some people here, you guys work for health departments. Most of the folks here, I think. And I no.
Just one health department.
Okay.
I think
I'm curious about harm reduction policies. If people have them, and those who don't, how far away are you from getting them, and how can we support you?
So at my agency, I don't think we have any harm reduction policy in place, but I think it is a matter of um, really just making that a priority as we move into this work. I think we have been slowly coming to the table and just realizing that this is one of those areas where we can do better and where we can show up for our community better. And so as we I wouldn't say in our infancy, but we're still in the beginning stages of what this looks like. So I'm sure, like I said, the policy is forthcoming. I would love to see, to be able to get more examples of what those look like, and what would be an effective systems level approach. What can we do, not just, restoratively from a person to person interaction, but what can we do as an agency to join that push at a systemic level, with our local providers, with also stepping into this, or stepping up their game with this population.
Thank you, Justin. What I have in the slide set and what I showed you, actually, our whole city in San Francisco, everyone has to have a harm reduction policy and address overdose. So, we've taken a huge stand. And I put the link for our Department of Public Health. So you can actually, that's in our website, and that's there, and I took the word. So you can just say, this is what San Francisco's doing. We still have a very high overdose, but it's a step in the right direction. And I steal from other people. It's one of the first principles in quality improvement. And, even in Philadelphia, I've actually stolen things from other cities. Look what they do here. So you can actually elevate that. This is on a higher level. I work with a drug policy a group, so that's really doing a lot of the work, and ask how I can be supportive. But even your health centers, we put some of those statements that I said, just even posting about where the syringe sites are, and some basic things if you want to put in that could be a first step. And maybe even posting some of the language that I gave you and going through the policies, just like we do with SOGI work that we had the discussion about. where can we actually destigmatize some of the language we have? And then screening is always a great place, expert, because health centers get reimbursed.
We are at the top of the hour. Thank you all for joining. I really hope that you've learned a lot from this conversation. Deb, thank you so much for facilitating this important conversation. The slide deck, as well as the link to the recording, will be sent out to all TA sites. So feel free to share with the members of your team. And thanks again today for joining. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.